In 52 B.C.E., Julius Caesar made the boldest gamble in ancient history.
50,000 Romans, trapped between two enormous Gaul armies, ready to crush them.
Caesar answered with genius. 2 colossal walls, deadly traps, and a battle fought in every direction.
In 2 days of fire and steel, Gaul collapsed, and one surrender reshaped Europe forever.
2 B.C.E., a decision was made on a lonely plateau in Gaul that would bend the path of Western civilization, and it began with an order that sounded like pure madness. Julius Caesar told 50,000 Romans to build their own grave, an immense ring of earth and timber that would lock them between the 80,000 warriors trapped in Alesia and the countless more sweeping in from the horizon. Think of it this way: a single Roman army sealing itself between 2 storms, one roaring from inside the fortress, the other rolling across the hills like a rising tide. No retreat, no safe path. Only walls the soldiers hammered into the soil with their own hands. To most commanders, this would have been suicide. To Caesar, it was a wager with history itself. He understood the stakes. For 6 long years he had fought across Gaul, crushing revolt after revolt, yet every victory seemed to summon a fresh enemy. Conquest was never the same as control. In Rome, his political rivals circled like wolves, waiting for him to stumble so they could strip his command, drag him to the courts, or bury him under charges. Failure in Gaul meant exile or death. Victory meant survival. And for Caesar, survival always grew into something greater. But against him now stood Vercingetorix, a name that would echo long after the smoke cleared. He was not just a chieftain, he was a symbol, a unifier. The first leader powerful enough to make ancient enemies stand shoulder to shoulder. More than 40 tribes, scattered from the shores of the Atlantic to the forests near the Rhine, had set aside centuries of feuds because one truth bound them together. Rome threatened to devour them all, and so Gaul rose like a single voice. The fortress city of Alesia became the heart of that voice. It sat on its plateau like a stone crown, wrapped in steep slopes and fed by rivers that coiled around the valleys. Every cliff favored the defender. Every approach was a death march. The Gauls thought it invincible. Vercingetorix believed he could sit atop his fortress until the great relief host arrived. To him, Caesar was trapped in a foreign land, low on supplies, growing desperate. But Caesar saw something that the Gauls did not. Yes, Alesia was strong. Its walls were thick and expertly built. Its high ground commanded every side. But the same cliffs that kept enemies out also kept an army in. The 80,000 warriors inside Alesia ate through their stores at a terrifying pace. The horses needed grain. The men needed thousands of meals each day. The city that promised safety was already becoming a cage. When Caesar's scouts returned with news of the terrain, they expected their commander to pick another target. Instead, he ordered 10 legions, men hardened by years of marching and killing, to surround the plateau and begin digging. The first wall would face inward, sealing Vercingetorix inside. The second, facing outward, would soon follow. To Caesar, the solution was simple. Don't storm the walls. Turn the entire mountain into a trap. Around him stood not only Roman infantry, but 10,000 Germanic horsemen, wild warriors from beyond the Rhine, men who had once fought Rome but now rode for Caesar in exchange for gold and blood. They were the perfect counter to Gaul's famed cavalry, and Caesar knew how to use them like the edge of a blade. His commanders formed a gallery of future legends. Labienus, sharp and disciplined. Mark Antony, still young but hungry for command. Marcus Brutus, the loyal subordinate who, years later, would plunge a dagger into Caesar's flesh. Even in 52 BCE, fate was already weaving iron threads between these men. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix looked down at the legionary columns spreading across the fields. He had 80,000 fighters, but they were not a single army. They were a mosaic of tribes. Some wore heavy mail. Others wore little more than cloaks. They carried different swords, different shields, different gods on their tongues. To unite them had been a triumph. To control them through starvation would be something else entirely. Still, Vercingetorix believed he held the advantage. He sent swift riders racing to every corner of Gaul. He demanded warriors from every tribe. A host greater than anything the land had ever seen began to take shape. If the Gauls could crush Caesar here, Rome's grip on Gaul would shatter in a single blow. But Caesar moved faster. The work began at once. Roman soldiers dug twin trenches wide enough for a wagon to cross and deep enough to swallow a man. Where the soil allowed, they filled one trench with water from the rivers. Behind these ditches, they raised a rampart of earth crowned with timber, battlements, and towers spaced so closely that no section was left exposed. The soldiers worked with shields propped above their heads, while Gaulish arrows whistled down from the heights. Every step forward meant a step closer to becoming targets, and still they built. Every hour the fortifications grew. Every day the circle tightened. Vercingetorix could see the growing ring from the walls of Alesia, yet every attempt to break out was beaten back. Gaulish warriors surged down the slopes in furious waves. Legionaries locked shields, endured the charge, and pushed them back. Some fought knee-deep in the dirt they themselves were digging. Construction and battle blended into one. Then Caesar received news that turned ambition into desperation. Scouts reported that the Gaulish relief force was moving. Not a single tribe, not 100, but an army that stretched beyond the hills. Hundreds of thousands marching for Alesia. A number so vast that even Caesar, the man who gambled with empires, felt the ground tilt beneath him. If he abandoned the siege, Gaul would rise again. If he stayed, he would be caught between the force inside the fortress and the greater force approaching from outside. He chose to stay. To his officers, he spoke with calm certainty. To his men, he walked among them as they worked. He told them they were not building their grave. They were building a weapon, one so perfect that Gaulish courage would break upon it like water on stone. And the murmur of fear faded. Day by day, the second wall rose behind the first. Trenches doubled, pits filled with hidden stakes, iron spikes buried just beneath the soil. A maze of obstacles carved from timber and iron and Roman discipline. A fearsome machine designed not to repel the enemy, but to swallow them whole. All the while, Caesar's supplies dwindled. The fields around Alesia had been burned by Vercingetorix before the siege. Wells had been fouled, grain stores destroyed. Every Roman ration carried the taste of urgency. Every mouthful warned them they were running out of time. And as the sun dipped behind the hills on a late September evening, the dust clouds of the relief army finally darkened the horizon. Then, at last, the true storm began. What happened next will make the first stage of the siege seem almost calm by comparison. Dawn broke across the hills, and for the first time the Romans saw the full scale of the relief army. It was like watching the land itself rise and move. Tens upon tens of thousands filling the ridgelines. Their banners flickered like sparks across the horizon. Their war cries rolled through the valleys in long, rising waves. To the legionaries standing on the ramparts, it felt as if the sky had grown teeth. The Gauls inside Alesia answered with their own roar, hammering weapons against shields, shouting down at the Romans between the walls. The trap Caesar built had finally closed. Now both storms would strike at once. From the western hills, a massive Gaulish contingent surged forward. These warriors moved with the confidence of men who believed victory was certain. Behind the Romans lay the inner fortifications. In front of them, the outer. They had no open field to fall back to, no space to breathe. The walls they built for safety were now the only things keeping them alive. The first assault crashed against the outer rampart like a wave striking a cliff. Thousands of Gauls charged at once, racing through fields littered with hidden pits and iron spikes. Men stumbled, men fell. Some vanished into the camouflaged holes, impaled on sharpened stakes. Others tripped on the iron traps buried under grass. But the bulk kept running, driven by the thunder of warriors behind them. Roman towers bristled with missile fire. Arrows streamed outward. Sling bullets cracked through the air. Heavy bolts from scorpions flashed in straight, deadly lines. Yet still the Gauls climbed, throwing ladders against the walls, clawing at the timber with bare hands if they had to. In minutes, the fight turned into a maelstrom of bodies heaving against one another through gaps in the battlements. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix unleashed his own storm. He knew the pressure must hit from both sides if it were to break the Romans. His warriors charged downhill, smashing against the inner fortifications. The Romans now faced an impossible task: fight a siege outward and inward at the same time. No army had ever attempted such a defense. No commander had ever dared to engineer such a battlefield. Signals blared along the Roman lines, horns calling for reinforcements, flags flashing instructions from tower to tower. Caesar's preparations now proved their worth. Every legion knew its place, every cohort its role. Reserves waited between the two rings of fortification, ready to sprint to whichever side buckled first, and they needed every heartbeat. Midway through the first assault, the northern sector neared collapse. The ground there was uneven, the construction harder. A Gaulish noble commander, Vercingetorix, saw the weakness. He led a surge that hit the rampart like a hammer blow. Roman shields bent, Roman lines wavered. Thousands of Gauls poured into the low ground, hacking at the timber with axes and driving their shields under the battlements. For a moment, just a moment, the wall seemed ready to buckle. Caesar saw it. He stood above the lines, his purple cloak bright in the dust and smoke. He shouted orders, sending cohorts racing to the danger. 6,000 Romans squeezed into the narrow stretch of rampart. They locked shields, braced their legs, and pushed back. It was a fight fought almost face to face. No space to thrust, barely room to lift a shield. The kind of fighting where a man could hear his enemy's breath. Still, the Gauls kept coming. Then the Germanic cavalry made their mark. Stationed between the two walls, the mounted warriors saw the northern line tottering. Without waiting for orders, they burst from a hidden gate behind the Roman lines, galloped wide around the battlefield, and struck the Gaulish flank with terrifying force. Their wild cries rose above the roar of combat. Their charge tore into the side of the attacking mass, breaking their momentum like a spear through a shield. The entire northern assault faltered. The pressure eased. The Romans held. But the storm was far from finished. As daylight thinned, fresh contingents of the relief army advanced. Gaulish torches flickered along the hills, carried by thousands preparing for a night assault. Fighting in the dark was a nightmare even for veterans. Shadows twisted into false shapes. Voices echoed in strange directions. Friend and foe blurred together. No commander could truly control his men under such conditions. The Gauls attacked anyway. They hurled themselves against the outer wall with renewed fury. Torches cast wavering light across the lily pits, but even then some stumbled in and vanished. Archers on both sides sent arrows through the dark. The Romans drove stakes into the earth, bracing the weakened sections. Men used ropes to haul ladders away from the walls. Others thrust downward with pila held like spears. Inside Alesia, the Gauls attacked again as well. 2 fronts, 1 night. Endless chaos. The inner wall shook under the force of the assault. There were moments when the Romans inside felt the timber flex as Gaulish warriors slammed their shoulders against it. In several places, the defenders resorted to hurling rocks straight down onto the crowded attackers, and still Vercingetorix pushed. Still Caesar resisted. By midnight, the fighting had turned into isolated pockets of chaos. Screams rising and falling, the crash of metal echoing through the dark, the dust and smoke turning the air thick as fog. Roman officers called for steady lines, but every man fought on instinct now. One legionary later described it as a night made of iron and fear. Only near dawn did the assault fade. The Gauls withdrew to regroup. The Romans slumped behind their ramparts, leaning on shields, trembling from exhaustion. Some had fought for hours without pause. Some had not slept in 2 days. Many bled from wounds they had not even noticed until the adrenaline faded. Yet the walls still stood. Morning came, revealing fields strewn with bodies and broken ladders. A thin mist clung to the earth, carrying the smell of sweat and smoke. For a moment, everything was quiet. But Caesar knew the worst was not behind them. He could see movement on the far hills, vast columns of fresh Gaulish warriors preparing for the next attempt. The great relief army had thrown only a fraction of its strength into the first attack. The real strike was still coming, heavier and more coordinated. Vercingetorix also saw the signs. From his vantage point atop Alesia, he understood the next assault would decide everything: Gaul's freedom, Rome's dominance, his own fate. He rallied his warriors, tightening their formations, preparing them for a final push the moment the relief force committed. Both leaders were preparing for the breaking point. When the sun reached its highest point, the signal finally rose from the Gaulish camp. A single horn blast, long and deep, swept across the hills, then another. Then hundreds more, echoing back and forth until the sound became a wall of noise rolling across the valley. Every Roman knew what it meant. The final assault had begun. What followed that horn blast would push both armies beyond the edge of human endurance. The relief force moved first. Their formations shifted across the hillside like a living tide. Lines of spearmen pressed forward. Behind them came warriors carrying long shields painted with spirals and beasts. Slingers lined the ridges. Cavalry massed on the flanks. It was the largest single coordinated attack Gaul had ever launched. A unified strike meant to break Caesar's double ring in one overwhelming surge. The Romans braced for impact. The assault opened with a storm of missiles. Stones, javelins, and arrows poured down on the outer wall. The air hissed with the sound of thousands of sling bullets cutting through the wind. Roman shields lifted as one, forming a shell of wood and iron across the battlements. Men crouched behind their scuta, waiting for the real blow to fall. It came seconds later. Great ladders slammed against the rampart. Gaulish warriors charged up them 3 at a time. Others hacked at the timber supports below, planting their feet among the graves of sharpened stakes. Some carried bundles of brush to throw into the trenches. The Gauls were learning. They were adapting. They were determined to force a breach no matter the cost. The Romans met them with brutal efficiency. Legionaries thrust downward with their pila used like long spears. They swung the gladius in tight arcs. They pushed ladders back, sending whole ranks of attackers tumbling into the chaos below. For a moment, the wall seemed to hold steady. But the Gauls were not attacking only one point. They surged toward the eastern sector at the same time, exploiting a slope that allowed them to reach the rampart faster. Trumpets blasted along the Roman line. Reserves raced toward the danger. Dust rose beneath their feet as they moved in tight, disciplined blocks. Every man understood the stakes. If even one section fell, both walls might collapse like a chain reaction. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix unleashed his warriors again. They stormed the inner fortifications with a ferocity born of desperation. They knew the relief force was committed. They knew the moment to break Roman resolve had come. Their war cries shook the ground. The Romans between the two walls felt the vibration under their boots. For the second time in 2 days, Caesar's army was fighting in two directions at once. The inner wall buckled under the strain. Gaulish warriors hurled spears over the battlements. Others tried to tear down the palisade with hooked poles. A few managed to climb the wooden stakes by sheer strength, their bodies silhouetted against the sky for an instant before Roman blades met them. Then came the first true crisis. The northwest sector, the most uneven terrain on the field, shuddered under a massive coordinated push. More Gauls poured into that low ground than any other point. They moved like a river bursting its banks. Even from Caesar's command position, the danger was clear. The wall sagged. The Roman defenders bent beneath the sheer weight pressing down on them. Labienus commanded that section. He had fought without sleep, without rest. His men were battered from the night assault. Now they faced a surge even greater than before. Messages flew toward Caesar in quick succession. The line was holding, but only barely. Something had to be done. Caesar made his decision. He ordered his final reserves forward, 13 cohorts, the last fresh troops he had. But he didn't just send them. He led them, cloak streaming behind him. He ran at the head of the column. Trumpets sounded across the battlefield as his men shouted his name. A shock of hope swept through the exhausted legionaries on the walls. Men who had fought for hours without pause suddenly straightened. Shields lifted. Eyes hardened. With Caesar beside them, they felt they could endure anything. The timing could not have been more critical. Just as Caesar's reinforcements reached the rampart, the Germanic cavalry repeated their daring maneuver from the day before. They burst from the rear gate and swept around the battlefield, aiming straight for the Gauls attacking Labienus's sector. Dust exploded from their hooves. Spears flashed. Their charge struck the Gaulish rear like a hammer. Caught between the Romans above and the cavalry behind, the attackers panicked. The entire northwest assault buckled in seconds. Gaulish warriors turned to flee, only to find escape impossible. Pits and spikes trapped them. Their own men blocked the way. The chaos crushed any hope of a second push. That wedge of the relief army crumbled and spilled back down the slope, leaving the ground littered with shields and bodies. But Caesar had little time to savor the victory. The assault on the eastern sector surged with renewed strength. Thousands of Gauls had been held in reserve specifically for this moment. They struck the rampart with such force that the timber shook. Roman defenders staggered. Officers shouted for reinforcements. Mark Antony, commanding that section, was surrounded by men fighting so fiercely they barely heard their own voices. It was the most critical moment of the siege. The Gauls inside Alesia saw the opportunity and doubled their efforts. They hurled javelins. They tried to light the palisade with torches. They rammed the wall with beams. A few even clambered over the shoulders of their comrades to reach the top. For a heartbeat, it looked like both the inner and outer walls would fall together. Caesar understood that if this moment broke, everything would end in a flood of ruin. He split his final reserves again, sending half toward Antony while he sprinted with the others toward the section nearest the inner wall. He arrived just as Gaulish warriors tore through a gap. The Romans wavered. Then they saw him. Their commander, dust-coated, blood-smeared, but unbroken. They surged forward. The Romans slammed into the breach with a roar that echoed off the hills. The Gauls, who moments before had been seconds from victory, suddenly found themselves pressed between fresh Roman steel and the defenders who had refused to break. The gap closed, the wall held, then came the turning point. From the northern hills, the Gaulish relief army saw their strongest attack falter. They saw the Germanic cavalry tearing through their flanks. They saw Caesar himself leading charges. Fear spread like fire through dry grass. What began as a controlled withdrawal twisted into a sudden collapse. The relief army began to run. It was not a retreat. It was a rout. Tens of thousands fled the field. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds. Those caught near the walls were cut down by Roman missile fire. Others trampled one another in their desperate flight. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched helplessly as the army he had summoned dissolved before his eyes. His warriors, still locked in combat at the inner wall, felt the shock ripple through their ranks. They faltered. They hesitated. They broke. Roman horns sounded the advance. Soon the ground between the walls was a chaos of fleeing Gauls and charging Romans. The Germanic cavalry spread across the fields, cutting down stragglers. The last pockets of resistance inside Alesia collapsed. Night fell before the killing stopped. By the next dawn, the great relief army was gone, and Alesia was surrounded in silence. Vercingetorix knew there would be no third chance. What follows from that silence is one of the most haunting conclusions in ancient warfare, a moment where an entire people realized their fate had already been sealed. Dawn crept over the plateau like a slow, cold breath. There were no horns, no war cries, no movement across the hills. The Romans stood behind their ramparts, bruised, blood-stained, and exhausted beyond words. Yet they held their shields ready, half expecting another surge from the outer fields. None came. The great relief army had vanished into the morning mist. What remained on the slopes were abandoned shields, broken spears, and the bodies of warriors who had given everything for the hope of one last stand. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix understood the truth before any scout confirmed it. He had watched the night before as the relief host dissolved into panic. He had seen their torches retreat into the darkness. He had listened through the long hours after midnight, waiting for the sound of returning forces, waiting for the earth to tremble beneath renewed marching feet. The tremble never came. Vercingetorix gathered his chieftains at first light. They met in a stone chamber within the fortress, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. The walls around them were lined with the symbols of their tribes: hawks, boars, suns, swirling lines of ancient meaning. Today those symbols felt like ghosts. There was no argument about what had happened. Every man in that room carried the same understanding. Gaul had lost its final chance. Some of the chieftains raged. Some cried. A few argued for one last attack, an all-or-nothing charge to die on their own terms. But most knew what such an act would bring. Their families were in the fortress, their clans, their children. A final assault would end in slaughter with no hope of mercy, and starvation was already tightening its fingers around their throats. They had grain for only a few more days. The horses were fading. Water was running thin. Vercingetorix listened to every voice, letting the storm of arguments crash and die around him. When all had spoken, he rose. His armor hung loosely on him after weeks of rationing. His cloak looked as though it had weathered 100 winters. Yet the room fell silent as he lifted his chin. "I united Gaul for freedom," he said, his voice steady. "I will not watch it perish for my pride." He declared he would take the responsibility alone. He would surrender himself to Caesar. In doing so, he hoped to save the rest: warriors, families, tribes, any who still had a chance to survive under Rome's terms. No one spoke after that. Even those who had demanded a last stand lowered their eyes. Vercingetorix walked alone to prepare. Outside, Caesar surveyed the battlefield with an expression that revealed nothing. He had won one of the most impossible victories in the history of the world. 50,000 Romans had stood against a host nearly 8 times their size. They had fought for 2 days and nights without rest. They had defended 2 walls at once. They had held every breach, and they had broken the greatest tribal army Gaul had ever called forth. But he also understood what came next. Victory on the field was only half the war. The aftermath would carve his name even deeper into Roman destiny. As the sun climbed the sky, a figure appeared at the gate of Alesia. It was Vercingetorix. He rode on his finest horse. His armor gleamed, polished bronze, etched with the marks of his tribe. He carried his shield across his saddle, not on his arm. Behind him, the people of Alesia watched from the walls, silent. The Romans fell quiet as well. Even hardened veterans who had survived the worst parts of the siege understood they were witnessing something that would echo through the ages. Vercingetorix rode slowly toward Caesar's command position. The path he took cut through the valley of the dead, where the bodies of his warriors lay scattered in tangled heaps between the 2 Roman walls. Dust rose around his horse's hooves as he moved forward. When he reached Caesar, he circled him once, a gesture loaded with meaning. To the Gauls, it was a final declaration of courage. To the Romans, it was a ritual acknowledgement of defeat. Then Vercingetorix dismounted. He removed his sword. He removed his armor. He placed them at Caesar's feet, and he knelt. Caesar did not rise from his seat. He did not speak. He simply watched as the greatest enemy he had ever faced bowed before him. The gesture was symbolic, perhaps even calculated, but it struck like a hammer across the watching armies. In that moment, Gaul ceased to be independent. In that moment, a continent changed. The Romans led Vercingetorix away. He would not die. Not yet. Caesar understood the value of a living symbol. The Gaulish leader would be kept in captivity for years, to be displayed later during Caesar's triumph in Rome, before meeting his end in the stone darkness of the Tullianum prison. Back at Alesia, the surrender began. Warriors filed out through the gates in long, staggering lines. They laid their weapons in piles so large that they formed small hills across the valley floor. Roman officers counted them, tribal group by tribal group. Day turned to night. Night turned to day again. The surrender continued. Those who belonged to tribes useful to Rome were released. Others, tens of thousands, were handed over to the legions as slaves, rewards for their years of bloody service. The Romans did not celebrate loudly. They had little strength left for cheering. Instead, they performed their duties with quiet, grim efficiency. For the Gauls inside Alesia, it was the end of a world. Their freedom had bled out on the fields below. Their hopes had fallen with the relief army. Their unity, hard-won, fragile, beautiful, shattered the moment their leader surrendered. For Caesar, it was the beginning of something greater. The Senate in Rome would not dare challenge him now. His enemies would hide their claws. His legions would follow him anywhere. A victory like Alesia did more than decide a campaign. It forged a legend. Yet even legends cast shadows. Across Gaul, towns burned. Resistance leaders were executed. Crosses lined the roads as a warning to any who still dreamed of revolt. Entire tribes vanished into Roman slavery. Others abandoned their gods and customs, adopting Roman ways in exchange for survival. The land itself, fields, forests, rivers, would be reshaped by Roman roads and Roman law. Alesia marked the moment Gaul passed from myth into history, from freedom into empire. But if you think this is the end of Caesar's story, it is not even close. The victory at Alesia would ignite ambitions far greater than Gaul. It would set the stage for betrayal, for civil war, and for Caesar's final rise and fall within the heart of Rome itself. What happened after Alesia did not bring peace. It unleashed a storm that would sweep straight into the heart of Rome. In the weeks that followed the surrender, Caesar moved with calculated precision. He knew Gaul was broken, but not yet silent. Scattered bands of warriors still hid in forests and mountains. Defiant tribes still clung to the hope that Rome might weaken or withdraw. Caesar would give them no such chance. He divided his legions, dispatching them across the land like an iron net. Some marched north to crush pockets of resistance. Others swept south to secure towns that had wavered in their loyalty. Every village that resisted was forced to submit. Every region that had supported Vercingetorix saw Roman standards rise over its fields. Yet Caesar himself stayed near Alesia for a time, where the cost of the siege continued to unfold. The dead were buried in long trenches. The wounded filled makeshift shelters. Roman engineers dismantled parts of the double fortification, salvaging timber and tools. Winter crept over the plateau. The air grew sharp. The land grew quiet. But Caesar was anything but still. He wrote reports. He sent letters to Rome. He shaped the narrative of Alesia before anyone else could. In his writings, he cast the battle as a triumph of order over chaos, civilization over barbarism, destiny over defiance. He described the courage of his men, the discipline of the legions, and the engineering marvel of the double walls. He downplayed Roman losses and emphasized Gaul's staggering collapse. He knew exactly what story Rome wanted to hear, and what story would make him untouchable. Meanwhile, the legions began to winter across Gaul, each in a fortified camp. Soldiers who had bled in the trenches of Alesia now enjoyed a few weeks of rest, repairing equipment, mending shields, and retelling the siege in 100 different versions. Some carved scenes of the battle into bits of wood. Others recounted the desperate night assaults, the Germanic cavalry charges, or the moment Caesar himself appeared at the breaking point, wearing his purple cloak like a banner. Their loyalty to him deepened into something unbreakable. But across the Alps, Rome was anything but calm. Caesar's political enemies, the Optimates, watched the news of Alesia with a mixture of awe and dread. His victory had turned him into the most celebrated general of his generation. The people loved him, the soldiers adored him, the Senate feared him, and Pompey the Great, once his ally, now viewed him as a rival whose power had grown far beyond control. Alesia had not ended the war. It had only shifted the battlefield. While Caesar secured Gaul, Pompey strengthened his position in Rome. He filled magistracies with his allies. He drew closer to the Senate's conservative faction. He controlled the city with quiet authority, his influence woven into every corridor of power. The first triumvirate, the alliance that once bound Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus together, had long since collapsed. Crassus was dead in Parthia. Pompey had remarried into a powerful family. Caesar's daughter, Pompey's wife, had died years earlier, breaking the personal tie that once held them together. The world had changed, and Alesia had accelerated that change. As winter deepened, Caesar met with his staff officers, Labienus, Antony, Trebonius, and others, to plan the next year's actions. Though Gaul was subdued, Caesar would not leave any opening for rebellion. He ordered new roads, new garrisons, new watchtowers along the frontier. He reorganized tribes, elevated friendly leaders, and punished those who had resisted. Rome was watching not just a conqueror, but an administrator building a province that would feed the empire for centuries. But the shadow of political conflict stretched longer each month. In Rome, Whispers swirled that when Caesar's command expired, he would be forced to stand trial for exceeding his authority, for waging unauthorized wars, for enriching himself through plunder. His enemies planned to strip him of immunity the moment he crossed the city boundary. Caesar knew this, and he knew they would show no mercy. That was why Alesia mattered so deeply. It wasn't only a military victory. It was an argument, a declaration that Caesar was too valuable to Rome to be discarded. His triumph had saved the Republic from a massive uprising, secured Gaul, and reshaped the map of Europe. It was a shield he hoped to carry back to Rome. But Pompey and the Senate saw something else. A man whose ambition could not be contained by borders or laws. Throughout the winter, Gaulish delegations visited Caesar's camp, bringing pledges of loyalty, hostages, and tributes. They came because they had no other choice. But even among them, there was a sense of weary respect. Caesar had beaten them with brilliance rather than sheer brutality. And though he punished harshly when needed, he also restored order quickly and allowed many tribes to retain local rulers. It was a Roman strategy as old as the Republic. Crush rebellion, then offer stability. By early spring, the last embers of Gaulish resistance flickered out. Caesar's officers reported quiet roads, open markets, and villages returning to their routines. The land that had once exploded in revolt now lay still beneath Roman authority. Alesia had not only ended the war, it had rewritten Gaul's future. Then Caesar moved. He marched south with select legions, crossing the cold valleys toward Italy. Everywhere he went, he received news from Rome, some troubling, some encouraging, all pointing toward a collision between himself and Pompey. Caesar intended to negotiate, to secure legal protections, and to ensure that his political enemies could not destroy him once he re-entered the city. But the Senate, driven by Pompey's influence, demanded he lay down his command first. They insisted he return as a private citizen, vulnerable and exposed. In return, they offered nothing. Caesar saw the trap instantly. To surrender his legions before reaching Rome would be to surrender his life. His enemies would prosecute him. They would exile him. They might even kill him. No man who had won a war as great as Alesia would willingly place his neck beneath such a blade. Meanwhile, his soldiers, loyal after years of marching, fighting, and bleeding, had no intention of abandoning him. They called him imperator, not governor. They viewed Pompey not as a savior of the Republic, but as the man who sought to betray the general who had led them to glory. The line between politics and war thinned. By the time Caesar reached the borders of Cisalpine Gaul, the Republic trembled on the edge of another conflict, one far greater than the wars in Gaul. The men who walked with him sensed it. Even the air seemed to carry the weight of coming battle. Alesia had crowned Caesar as Rome's greatest commander, but it had also pushed him toward the moment that would reshape the Republic forever. One river now separated him from Rome, a narrow line of water that would soon become the most famous boundary in history. What happened at that river would echo longer than the cries of any battlefield in Gaul. Caesar reached the banks of the Rubicon as winter softened into spring. The stream itself was narrow, little more than a ribbon of water winding through quiet countryside. Farmers led their mules along the roads. Smoke curled from distant cottages. Nothing about the place suggested the collapse of a republic. Yet everyone who marched beside Caesar felt the tension thickening in the air. This was the boundary Rome had set. No general was permitted to cross it while still commanding an army. To do so was to declare war on the state. To cross it with legions who adored him, legions hardened by battles like Alesia, was to challenge Pompey, the Senate, and centuries of law. Caesar stood on the bank for a long moment. Behind him lay Gaul, where he had forged victories through iron will, cunning engineering, and relentless ambition. Ahead lay Italy, where political knives waited in the shadows. The men who followed him were ready. Their faces showed a fierce loyalty shaped by years of campaigning. They trusted him more than they trusted the Senate. They believed in him more than they believed in Rome's promises, yet Caesar hesitated. Even for him, this was no ordinary choice. He thought of his enemies in the Senate. He thought of Pompey, once a friend, now a rival drawn into the arms of Caesar's political foes. He thought of the charges that awaited him, the humiliation, the forced exile, the loss of everything he had built. He thought of Crassus, of the daughter he lost, of the triumvirate shattered by time and fate. He thought of Vercingetorix kneeling at his feet after Alesia. Power won on the battlefield had brought him here. Power kept must now be taken with equal boldness. The river murmured softly at his feet. Then he spoke. The die is cast. He crossed. The Rubicon swallowed his reflection and parted around his boots. Trumpets sounded behind him. The legions followed, their armor glinting, their steps steady. The quiet countryside watched as the greatest army of its age marched south to claim the future. From that moment, the Republic began to unravel. News reached Rome like a shockwave. Senators fled in panic. Pompey retreated southward, gathering what forces he could. Streets filled with rumors. Markets choked with frightened citizens. Some whispered that Caesar came to restore order. Others swore he meant to make himself king. But Caesar did not storm the city. He marched with discipline and restraint, taking towns without bloodshed, offering terms to those who would stand aside. The memory of Alesia followed him, his reputation alone causing garrisons to surrender before a single blade was drawn. His strategy was swift and deliberate. He wanted legitimacy, not chaos. He wanted to present himself as the defender of Rome, not its destroyer. Yet war was inevitable. Pompey gathered his armies across the sea, calling senators, nobles, and loyal legions to join him in Greece. Caesar prepared to follow, but every step he took, every mile he marched, carried the shadow of Alesia behind it. The siege had taught him patience, engineering, resolve. It had taught him how to break enemies who believed themselves unbreakable. It had shown him how to win against impossible odds. Now he brought those lessons to a civil war. The veterans of Alesia formed his core. They marched with the confidence of men who had survived storms few others could imagine. When Caesar rallied them, he spoke not only of Rome, but of Gaul, of Alesia, of the double walls they built with their own hands. He reminded them they had trapped themselves between two armies far larger than Pompey's. They had stood their ground. They had cut down foes who outnumbered them by the measure of entire nations. To these men, nothing seemed impossible anymore. Years passed. Battles raged across Greece, Egypt, Africa, and Spain. Caesar won again and again, at Dyrrhachium, at Pharsalus, at Thapsus, at Munda. Each victory deepened his legacy. Each victory pushed the Republic closer to a new order. And through every campaign, the veterans who had survived the horrors of Alesia fought at his side with unwavering devotion. But victory came with a cost. Power brought enemies. Glory brought envy. Caesar's triumphal return to Rome was magnificent. Crowds cheering his name, celebrations stretching for days, trophies from Gaul paraded through the streets. And at the center of that parade walked the symbol of Alesia's end. Vercingetorix, gaunt after years in captivity, displayed before the Roman people as the ultimate proof of Caesar's greatness, yet the triumph ended in darkness. The Gaulish leader was led to the Tullianum and executed. A final silent punctuation to the story of Alesia. Afterward, Caesar attempted reforms. He forgave enemies. He passed laws. He tried to stabilize a republic already cracking under its own contradictions. But in the Senate, Fear grew like a rot. Senators whispered that no man should hold so much power. No victor should rise so far above the state. The knives that ended his life were sharpened long before they ever touched his flesh. When Caesar fell beneath those blades on the Ides of March, the echoes of Alesia were still in the air. Some of the men who stabbed him had fought beside him in Gaul. Some had followed him through winter marches and night battles. The betrayal that struck him in the heart was as shocking as any blow he had faced on the field. Yet the world did not collapse with him. Rome descended into chaos. Civil wars erupted once more. But the transformation he had unleashed did not fade. The Republic never returned to what it had been. The old order broke, and from its ashes rose something new, an empire that would stretch across continents and endure for centuries. And at the foundation of that empire stood the victory at Alesia, a battle where 50,000 Romans built 2 vast rings of fortification beneath screaming skies, trapping themselves between storms of enemies and refusing to break. A battle where engineering became a weapon, discipline became a shield, and a commander's audacity bent the arc of history. The double walls still echo in textbooks, in military academies, in every lesson about turning impossible situations into triumph. Alesia became a symbol, a warning, a blueprint, a legend. For the Gauls, it was the end of independence. For Caesar, it was the rise of destiny. For Rome, it was the spark that lit the final years of the Republic. And for the world, it was proof that history is shaped not only by armies or nations, but by moments when a single leader dares to take a step no one else believes possible. Just as Caesar did when he stood before a narrow river, remembering the walls of Alesia, and whispered to himself, "The die is cast.